Everybody on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, or good evening to anybody joining from Europe or other areas. My name is Peter Loge. I'm the director of the Project on Ethics in Political Communication and an associate professor at the George Washington University. Happily hosting everybody here today. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to note the passing of Herman Cain, pizza magnate and Republican presidential candidate. As all of you by now know, he succumbed to COVID-19. And I know all of our thoughts are with Mr. Cain's family. Another reminder that we may not all be in the same boat, but we are indeed all in the same storm. So with that, now that we're in, I believe it's March 152nd, if my math is correct, we're now the 152nd day of March. And I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's conversation on ethics and digital political communication. Before we introduce our panel and get into it, I do have to say thanks to the GW team putting this together, working with me on this, Connor Kilgore, Jason Rucker, and Zachary Nosenchuk, all of whom are undergraduates in the School of Media and Public Affairs. They'll be live tweeting this. They're going to be feeding the chats. They're going to be the ones editing this and putting it up online when it's over. So, be nice to them, thank them. Thanks on all of our behalf, guys, for doing all of that. I launched the Project on Ethics and Political Communication, of which this conversation is a part, about a year ago to promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. If any of you majored in or studied journalism, business, medicine, public relations, any number of other fields, you took classes in ethics. There are books, journals, conferences, entire infrastructures for ethics for people who go into any range of fields. That is not really the case in political communication. It was thousands of years ago. Politics, philosophy, rhetoric were all the same field. They have drifted quite apart for quite a while. It's time to reunite them. And so we've done that. Over the past year and a half or so, we've hosted events in person, back when one could host events in person. We've hosted video chats like this one, most recently with Professor Mark McPhail, a rhetorical scholar in Indiana and proud Emerson College alum, race, racism, and the limits of rhetoric. When COVID began to sweep through the world, we had a video chat with a former member of Congress, the head of campaigns and elections, and a philosopher about the ethics of campaigning for office during a pandemic. And we've held video chats with just people typing back and forth with the heads of the college Republicans and college Democrats at GW who share an office. Back when any of us were allowed to go to an office, they'd be in the same one. We held another one with Sarah Isgur, who's the former communications director for then U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and Mo Elliothy, who is now at Georgetown, but was the communications director for the Democratic National Committee. We have a 5-question series where we ask political pundits, practitioners, and others the same 5 questions about ethics and political communication. Those are posted online. Some of you have taken part in those. I've given talks around the country, geographically from Yale to Oregon State, and a bunch of places in between, spoken at national conferences, and at a range of places about ethics and political communication, including at Purple Strategies, where one of our panelists works. I was reaching out to universities and others who I think would want to talk about ethics. It didn't occur to me to talk to consulting firms. Purple called me and said, we're committed to ethical practices, but we need to continue having that conversation. Can you come in? Which I thought was really fantastic and spoke highly of them. We've written for National Communications Association, The Hill, a range of other organizations that have been interviewed in a bunch of places. Some of you may have read the interview in the Deseret News a week or so ago, which has been really fantastic. And from my perspective, the cool new thing we have going on, in addition to today's conversation, is a textbook that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks called Political Communication Ethics, Theory, and Practice. It'll be the first book of its kind. Half the chapters are from academics, including some of you here today. Vincent Raynauld co-authored a chapter, for example, with his colleague, Jennifer Lees-Marchand, who is not with us because I believe she's in Australia or New Zealand, and those time zones just do not work in our favor in this case. The chapters cover Machiavelli, the pre-Socratics, speech writing, digital ethics, and a range of fields. The other half of the book is written by political practitioners, including a chapter co-authored by Cheryl Contee, who's with us today, and her business partner, Rosalind Lemieux, writing about digital ethics. Others include a former senior advisor to President Trump's 2016 campaign, a former senior advisor to President Obama, a speechwriter who is on the Biden campaign, a former Republican opposition researcher, and others. It's designed as a textbook, but I think it'll be interesting, legitimately interesting to folks who are interested in politics and communication. Certainly Vincent and Cheryl's chapters are worth reading. After this, I'll send an email as a follow-up to everyone who registered for this event that'll include a flyer about the event, about the book that includes a discount code. So that's kind of what we're up to. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, sign up to get our emails. You'll get all of our stuff. We think it's pretty cool. But to today's conversation, first some logistics, then I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to dive in. You'll notice all of you are on mute. I'm certain all of you have smart, interesting things to say. I just want to make sure nobody's distracted by sirens or typing or dogs or other stuff that we all know on Zoom can cloud backgrounds of these sorts of things. The chat is, however, open, as you can see. So if you have thoughts or questions as we go through, please throw them up in the chat. The team here is also going to throw links in the chat, for example, links to everybody's bios and other things which we might find interesting or that come up during the conversation. As I said, we are recording this. We are going to put it up online later today, ideally. Jason is going to be cutting little pieces of it and putting it out on social media, so this will be out in the world and available for everybody. And I'm going to introduce the panel, start the conversation off. We're just going to see how it rolls for a while. And about 45 minutes in, I'm going to then turn to the panelists for closing thoughts, and we're going to be out by 1 out of respect for everybody's time. So with that, I think that's all the logistics. I think I certainly forgot something, but hopefully those are the important bits. I am incredibly thrilled to have our panel with us today. Based on last week's prep conversation, this is going to be a terrific discussion. In alphabetical order, the people we have with us today are Cheryl Contee, who I've known for, as she pointed out last week, a very long time, because we are apparently old. Cheryl, that was your words, not mine. The shorthand way to introduce Cheryl is that if you have an idea for digital ethics or digital campaigning, Cheryl thought of it 2 weeks ago and either monetized it or already rejected it as not being worth the effort. The official bio is she's the co-founder and CEO of Do Big Things, which brings new narrative and new technology like blockchain, AI, bots, and machine learning to advocacy campaigns. She's the author of Mechanical Bull, How You Can Achieve Startup Success, a best-selling book about navigating the venture capital world in Silicon Valley. It's written from the perspective of a Black woman entrepreneur. The lessons, I read the book and know how the lessons apply to all of us as well. Really terrific book. She was the co-founder of Fission Strategy, co-founder of social marketing software Attentively at Blackbaud, the first tech startup with a Black female founder on the board in history to be acquired by a NASDAQ-traded company, co-founder of Yes We Code, which represents a movement to help low opportunity youth achieve high quality tech careers, co-founder of Jack and Jill Politics, the leading top Black audience targeted blog during the 2008 and 2012 election cycles, listed among the Influencers 50 in Campaigns and Elections magazine, named as an affiliate at Harvard University's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, inducted to the first Route 100 list of established and emerging African-American leaders. Huffington Post included her as a top 27 female founders in tech to follow on Twitter, as did Black Enterprise. Fast Company named her one of their 2010 most influential women in tech. That is the short version of the bio. The rest of it is online. As we speak, she's being named to another top 10 list. I'm really thrilled also to be joined by Bradley Engle at Purple Strategies. As I said, I've got a tremendous amount of respect for Purple. A lot of bipartisan political consulting firms in Washington are a bunch of Republicans with a Democratic friend they convince to come in and they bring to meetings, or it's a bunch of Democrats with their Republican friend they're bringing into meetings. Purple is legitimately bipartisan. They don't claim to be anything they're not. They work together when it makes sense, and when it doesn't, they don't. They work separately. They also don't do candidates, which I think probably helps them quite a bit. Bradley is in his second tour at Purple, I believe. In between his times at Purple, he served as the digital director for the Koch network's public relations firm In Pursuit Of, and their largest grassroots group, Americans for Prosperity, where he developed digital strategies that harnessed their 3.2 million activists to achieve educational policy and political outcomes. He was the digital director for the Jindal for President campaign and Governor Jindal's American Future Project. So he has seen digital from the candidate and advocacy angles and has been tremendously, tremendously successful in doing that. Finally, the academic, the smart guy in the panel, Vincent Raynauld, has recently earned tenure at Emerson College. Congratulations. And is, I'm a graduate of Emerson College and kind of a homer for the school. He's also an affiliate, I'm going to butcher the French, apologies in advance. He's an affiliate professor in the Department de Lettres et Communication et Sociale at the Université de Québec et Trois-Rivières. He's also serving as a research associate in the Groupe de Recherche et Communication Politique, a member of the Réseau de Démocratie électronique based at the University of Paris et Créteil in France, a member of the North American Advisor for the nonprofit research organization Samara in Canada. His areas of research and publication include political communication campaigns, political protest politics, social media, research methods, political marketing, e-politics, and journalism. His list of refereed and requested articles and book chapters is long and daunting. They're both written in both English and in French, and apparently my St. Thomas's Day School elementary French let me down there. Vincent, I apologize for that. His writing, of course, includes co-authoring a chapter in the forthcoming Political Communication Ethics, Theory and Practice, which is due out in several weeks. So with those introductions, I am now going to turn I would now want to just start the conversation with our distinguished panel, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order initially, and then as we close, I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. The question on the table for the project on ethics and political communication is what, if any, ethical obligations those who engage political communications have, and to who or what do they have those obligations? Potentially big, potentially daunting conversation, but before we get to the digital piece of it, let's ask that baseline question. And working alphabetically, I want to start with you, Cheryl. What's your take on this?
Absolutely. Well, ethics fundamentally centers on, what kind of society do we want to live in, right? And, do we want to create a society in which truth, for example, is important, right? That we all agree on a platform of, reality, as we can see it, of scientists, scientific inquiry, of, conduct that leads to a peaceful, prosperous, as equitable as possible society, right? So, that's ethics. I mean, we could go Greek, we could talk about Kant, but, many people smarter than me have explored this question of, the concept even of ethics, and is that something that we want? And I think, we are lucky, here in the United States to, enjoy an economy, and, until recently a political body that was, minimal on corruption. When you look at, some other societies around the world, truth is blocked or distorted or controlled, corruption is rampant, and these are ultimately distorting factors on societies. Those societies ultimately experience more upheaval, they experience more poverty. There are, it is not meritocratic in that you don't have the best and brightest ideas, that then help propel society and human achievement forward. So, then, working then from there, ethics, subcategory politics, is that important? Right? I think that it is. If we, when we look back to the society of Athens, right, we can see a group of people that tried really hard, to bring as many people into the decision-making process for society as possible. And even thousands of years later, we marvel at what they were able to achieve. And so, but no one admires, the government of Ceausescu in Romania, right? Like that's not right. So, I think that there is intrinsic value in creating ethics and politics because, we intuit that it is right and that it stands the test of time.
So, Bradley, what do you think? What's your take on this?
So I tried to go back and pull from college ethics class. Don't have strong memory from it. So went to Wikipedia, went to a few other places just so I wouldn't sound like an idiot. And everything, centered what I previously believed. It's about right and wrong, and I systematizing what's right and wrong. And obviously the application of that varies quite a bit, even in the concept of digital politics. On the consulting side, there's right and wrong in how you advocate for your client, how you treat your client from a business perspective. Then there's, when you're talking about advocating for a client or for an idea, doing so in an honest way, doing so that follows obviously the law. But I think this is a particularly interesting topic because the law hasn't really kept up with technology. So there are a lot of things that can be done right now that are technically legal but might not be right to do. So to me, that this feels like a very interesting topic, and glad you're having these conversations and teaching this at GW, because a lot of the issues I'm sure we're going to talk about today just aren't ever going to be regulated in a way that's fast enough to keep up with them, that is smart enough to recognize how technology actually works and how it's used. So, having conversations about what is right and what is wrong with some of the stuff, I think is really important.
So Vincent, you've heard from the practitioners. You presumably know right and wrong, right? You've got a PhD. You teach at Emerson College. What's your answer to the big question?
Sure. Well, before I start, I do want to acknowledge the involvement of my co-author in my book chapter, Jennifer Lee Marshman, who's based at the University of Auckland. She's been instrumental in helping me make sense of ethics and political communication marketing. And what is really interesting is I approach political communication really from a marketing perspective in that book chapter, looking at how marketing plays a role in political communication. And as much as we're having a conversation about ethics in political communication, there's also a similar conversation going on about ethics in marketing. So I think it's really interesting to sort of merge these two conversations. What I would say is ethics is really a standard of conduct that is derived from principles of right or wrong, right? So when we're talking about right or wrong, we're really talking about what is right, what is good, and what is appropriate. What I really find interesting is that I think we need to see ethics as a living organism, right? Which evolves over time. And I would say that two elements have really forced ethics to evolve over the past decades. The first one is obviously the transformation of technology. So for example, whether it's Web 1.0 in the 1990s, whether it's texting in the early 2000s or social media more recently, it has really changed the way in which practitioners and politicians approach media and how they reach out to members of the public. But it's also the other way around. It's also how people perceive politics. And we've seen in the last few decades that the perception of politics is becoming increasingly different. And for a lot of people, there's a blurring of the line between public and private. And increasingly, people are perceiving politics as a very private thing. If you go on Twitter these days and you look at the responses to politicians' tweets, it's a very personal response that you see. A lot of people take this very personally. And I'm suspecting that this is shifting the way in which people behave ethically in the political process. So obviously this change is impacting how politicians reach out to people. And it's impacting how people perceive politics. So this sort of really interesting dynamic is certainly having an effect on how people see, and more importantly these days, feel what is ethical or not ethical. And I think the notion of emotion is really important in this ethics conversation that we're going to be having.
So thank you for the big picture view, and I think you and Bradley begin to get at something which is the point of today's conversation, the digital piece. I'm actually going to steal a question from Errol Yabok, a friend and neighbor who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We were talking about this a week or so ago, socially distant, shouting at each other from each other's porches. We talk about digital media, social media as being especially a threat, being especially problematic. We had the hearings yesterday on the Hill with the leaders of some of the world's largest companies who are also, digital and technology companies. And the questions were wide ranging, right? About data, about monopoly, about bias. when we say that digital communications, digital advocacy is a threat, what is it a threat to? What is AI or bots or information harvesting or any of that? Exactly what is being threatened by all of this?
Well, so breaking that into a couple parts, the last couple components you had, you know, when you're talking about bots, for example, having inauthentic behavior influence political discourse is just inherently problematic. You know, it's, at least from my perspective, but I think certainly from societal perspective, if I want my opinions known and I go to my Twitter account, you know, have at it, you know, people can engage with it or not. But if I suddenly have, you know, 10,000 accounts at my disposal, that creates a perception, particularly with how, like, I think where this becomes a truly big problem is the way the media engages with social content, especially from a social listening perspective, is highly problematic in that they are finding the content that fits a narrative. If you look at how tweets are used in stories, it will say the internet reacted with a furor, and you'll have 3 handpicked tweets that back up the point of view. And it's not that the entire internet felt that way. It's that these 3 random people that may or may not be influential felt that way. But the chance that you're able to influence public discourse when you have 10,000 people tweeting something, or you have bots that retweet something 10,000 times, because those are all signals of perceived influence, becomes really, you know, problematic. You know, one last quick example: if you look at the polls news organizations run off after debates, you oftentimes will see people manipulating them. And to have, you know, I don't know if NBC uses this type of poll, but let's just say NBC did it, to have NBC reporting that Marianne Williamson had, you know, 10% of people thought she won the debate. Like that doesn't really help discourse when that's a manipulated number, but that kind of inflates potentially the importance of her campaign.
Cheryl, Vincent, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there and just, you know, define artificial intelligence, because it's a term we, you know, sort of have out there, but that, you know, people don't always, you know, really, you know, think through, you know, what does that mean? What are we actually looking at? So, you know, AI is, you know, a family of technologies that allows for automation, acceleration, and, you know, exponential scalability of human perception, decision making, and reasoning. And then within that, you've got machine learning or deep learning, which is a concept within AI that allows systems to recognize patterns and data that humans might not pick up on their own. Now, this is technology that underpins all of the social platforms, right? That people are, you know, where a lot of the political communications are happening now, you know, and part of the issue there is that, you know, algorithms can be wrong. You know, AI is only as good as the data that's put into it. And so, you know, we're, you know, forced in this situation. You know, a friend of mine, Eli Pariser, you know, you guys probably know him as well, wrote, you know, all about this in The Filter Bubble, where you have, you know, the ordinary human conversations that people used to have within their communities now distorted, warped, you know, changed, transformed. You know, our political marketplace of ideas is different because of, you know, the way in which AI is impacting human perception, decision making, and reasoning. And so, you know, we're adapting in real time to that, successfully, unclear, right? You know, but I do think that it's important for folks, you know, to really be, you know, grounded in that, because it's from there that we can start to, you know, make a difference.
So, but Cheryl, I read your bio word for word from the Do Big Things website, and it says y'all use AI. what are the limits of that? How do you put guardrails around what you will or won't do and how you will and won't behave?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and look, whether we want to use AI or not, it's out there. Anyone who is running a Facebook ad or an Instagram ad or working, in Twitter is using AI, whether you want to or not. Okay, so it's happening to you as we speak. When we use Facebook Insights, to understand, what's happening. All of that is machine learning, and AI. We are working actually with our strategic partners, Swayable, which is a software product, on a study around some of the language that's emerging from the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we actually, informed by linguistic analysis provided by IV/AI, which is a leading AI and natural language processing company, we identified 5 major themes in the social media conversation around defunding the police. And so we, looked at, defund the police versus, abolish police, police reform, reimagine police, and it was really interesting to see, how, we were able to use, that's using AI and NLP in a positive way to just better understand, in, real time, a large conversation out there, who's responding to what. What we found is that people under 35 love the words defund the police. They think that's great. Everybody else makes them a little uncomfortable. But in some ways, the language that, people, across the board liked is much more subversive. Reimagine was one of the most popular. Reimagining in some ways is a much more radical concept than defunding, right? And it's a much bigger concept. So, I do think, that there are ways, in which we're using AI, in positive or even just neutral ways, and we don't have a choice. None of us do.
So before I go to Vincent, I do have to put in a plug for a tech guy who's also on this, who's also a college classmate from Emerson College, Craig Vachon, who wrote a fun book that's an alarming look at what Cheryl was just talking about called Knucklehead of Silicon Valley. I'm sure he would be happy to put a link to the book up in the chat, Craig. But it takes what Cheryl and Bradley have been talking about from a fun perspective and points out where it doesn't always go as Cheryl suggested it might. So academically, Vincent, you study this. How much of this is what Cheryl's doing is widespread? How much is more, like, how bad is this? What are you seeing in all of it?
Well, I just want to build on what my 2 colleagues just said. I think what's important here is I don't think there's something inherently good or bad about these new technologies. I mean, AI has really good elements, as Cheryl pointed out, and it has really bad elements. It's really about the guidelines guiding the use of these technologies. And these, the way in which these guidelines are developed, I mean, one piece of it is obviously education. You need to educate people on these technologies and then, really make sure that people understand the impact of these technologies. And it's also maybe government intervention. I know many countries out there are pondering about laws or maybe limits that they could put. I know my home country of Canada, there's some intense discussions right now on how you can regulate AI and how can you regulate all these technologies. But something that's near and dear to me as well is, of course, you can sort of control and try to frame the use of AI from a top-down perspective, right? So how are politicians using this? How are political parties using this? How are governments using this? But another aspect that I think is really important is educating the public on what that is. Whether you want to call it political campaigning literacy, digital campaigning literacy, I think it's really important for members of the public to truly understand what that is. And to make a parallel, I've been giving a lot of interviews on false information or disinformation online. And what I find interesting is a lot of interviewers are always asking, how can governments do something about this? How can platforms do something about this? So there's this sort of vision of saying, hey, maybe it's the governments and people, the elites that are in charge of really, making sure that this works. And they have a big responsibility in this. But I think it's also about educating the public. Is the public aware of what's going on? I have students of mine that often, are horrified by what's going on, with, you probably saw the recent documentaries on Netflix about use of data in politics. And they always say, oh my God, this is terrible, to which I reply, well, Amazon has been using this for years when it comes to recommendation of products and these type of things. So this is not a new thing. However, this is really impacting a core element of our democratic life. This is no longer only consumerism. It's really about the political life and the democratic life in the United States. And I think there needs to be a serious conversation about, can these tools be used? And if these tools are used, how can they be used? And what's the framework guiding the use of these tools?
Well, if it's not the government's job, whose job? Is it Bradley and Cheryl's job to tell us how to do this? I mean, we're having the conversation, right? I mean, this is one of many, many conversations. But AI and bots, I've got colleagues at GW who run the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics who are having conversations like this. We're having the conversation. Whose job is it to make sure these tools are used either benignly or for the public good or for a broader democratic good and not to undermine the core tenets of our democracy?
I think it's all of our job. Like we all live in this society together, and all of the pieces of our society need to be in agreement and work together, in order to, create that platform, of ethics. Just to say that it's the company's job, that clearly isn't working, right? We can all see that that's not working. Is it only government's job? Well, when you've got, a bunch of people, trying to legislate something that they don't understand, right, and think is a series of tubes, that's not going to help either, right? Is it my job or Bradley's job? We don't run these companies or the government, right? So it's all of us working together in conjunction, including ordinary citizens. What is the everyday citizen's role in ethical communication? Are you a troll? Are you actively poisoning, the body politic, or are you providing, better communications, right? That's something that we're not talking about, right? The ordinary everyday citizen's role, as we once did.
So Bradley, is it your job or is it the citizen's job? What do you think?
Well, I'd agree. It's society's job, perhaps, government's job. I definitely don't think it's Facebook or Twitter's job. And, they certainly have a role to play. I have a problem with this notion that they're responsible for deciding what's true and false. There are certain things that are clear-cut true and false. If someone was to say election day was November 1st, clearly not true. The problem in political communications is a lot of what's said is not black or white, but gray. And if you look at PolitiFact, a lot of conservatives would tell you that the conclusions they come to are incredibly biased. So the question becomes, do we want billionaires and Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg being the ones that decide this is true or this is false, this is hate speech, this isn't hate speech? To me, those are bigger societal questions. I don't know what the answer. I do think it's not them for sure. There's actually a really good article. It's the Cloudflare article I sent you if we want to put it to the chat. But after Charlottesville, there's this company Cloudflare, and it basically protects the majority of the internet. It stops hackers or others from taking down websites. And this company was being used by the Daily Stormer, which was a Nazi site, to protect them from being taken down. And after Charlottesville, the CEO of Cloudflare said, "Screw these guys! They're not using my site anymore," and the site went down. And I think in this case, we can all hopefully agree on this chat. Now, Nazis are bad. And so from that perspective, yes, screw those people, glad their website got taken down. But from an ethical or from a bigger picture internet question, he raises some really interesting questions. And I'm gonna try and read one quick part of it, or he gets to kind of some bigger picture questions about responsibility of the internet. And he starts by saying they took it down. His rationale for making the decision was simple. The people behind Daily Stormer are assholes, and I'd had enough. Let me be clear, this was an arbitrary decision. It was different than what I talked about yesterday. I woke up this morning in a bad mood and decided to kick them off the internet. Having made that decision, we now need to talk about why it's so dangerous. I'll be posting something on our blog later today. Literally, I woke up in a bad mood and decided someone shouldn't be allowed on the internet. No one should have that power. And so, like, to me, that's been a really powerful quote that I've been thinking a lot about for the last few years. Like, who should have that power? Because if it's a single person, like in this case where we're kicking Nazis off the internet, like, great. But when you start to get into the notion of right and wrong, it's easy to get to a slippery slope of Republicans are bad, so I'm going to kick them off. Democrats are bad, so I'm not going to let them use my service. And that certainly isn't good for democracy, to have one person or a small group of people in charge of those decisions.
I think that makes sense in a democratic sense, right? I mean, the Enlightenment is premised at some level. One of the insights of the Enlightenment is a marketplace of ideas, right? Let the best ideas win. We're going to debate them out. Arguably, this starts with Protagoras, and in some of his writings, even the dialogue, even Plato's dialogue, Protagoras. But at some point, we agree, like, Nazis bad. Okay, somebody has to draw that. And if it's not the government, we should all do it. The people, I still don't know whose job it is. And what if, so somebody asks in the chat, what if people don't do the job? What if I, as a citizen, say, I would love to behave better, but nobody else is behaving better, so I have to behave badly, right? One of my frustrations as a chief of staff in the House is that we were always one election away from governing. We'll do it right next time. How do you enforce good and appropriate behavior if you can't ensure that everybody's going to be a good actor and not people aren't owning fixing the problem?
Well, as a technologist, I know, as I work with a lot of developers, that a lot of these tools and platforms have been built by people who are more comfortable with machines and code than with other people. And the Stop Hate for Profit, two of our former clients, Color of Change and NAACP, who are run by friends of mine, are among those leading the boycott of Facebook. But part of what they're asking Facebook to do is enforce their own policies. They actually have a terms of service. They have a community standards document. Are those weak? Could they be improved? Does government or society, should they have a role in what those community standards and terms of service look like? Maybe, but to a certain extent, part of the tension is, look, you say that you stand for certain basic principles, such as truth. Like, truth, to a certain extent, is not that subjective. There is, if we started talking about right and wrong, and people are saying there are things that are wrong, like Facebook has actively contributed and allowed things that are wrong to perpetrate, to corrosively, make sure that certain people in certain countries die. Like, do we ask Facebook to take some responsibility, even in the absence of, legislative power?
So for the 30,000 foot level, Vincent, can you build on this from Craig Vachon, who's a technologist, right? He has seen and helped nurture and fund a lot of these companies we're talking about. And he asks, do tech or other companies have a responsibility when their offerings are being misused? These are private companies like Cloudflare, so do they have a responsibility to the First Amendment, or is it the term service? What is it? And this is a guy who knows this stuff inside and out. He's helped build and fund some of these companies.
It's a truly interesting question because, as Cheryl said, I think, governments have a role to play, companies have a role to play. I don't think they should be the main drivers of the process, but they have a role to play. And the public has a role to play as well. But what I really find interesting as well, and this is something that's been at the core of my research, is really the notion that this conversation about ethics needs to be very inclusive, right? I worry sometimes that, when we're talking about ethics, first of all, people don't necessarily have the same understanding of what's good and what's bad. I think this varies from person to person and from, country to country. This varies a lot, very significantly. But there's also the fact that a lot of minority and marginalized communities are not part of the conversation. And this is something that's truly important to me. I mean, I've worked a lot with on a project dealing with the presence of indigenous communities and indigenous nations online. And I'm really truly interested about the fact that sometimes these algorithms or these bots or these other mechanisms are really removing them from the conversation, or maybe not taking into account some of their concerns or some of their objectives into the conversation. So it's a really complicated process, and it's also about finding a way to make sure that the conversation considers and informs everybody. I know for a fact that, for example, a lot of people are not really informed of what's going on, and these new technologies evolve so quickly that at some point it's hard to get people to first of all, to understand what is going on and be able to take an informed position about what's going on. So I think there's a lot of work that's there for us. And obviously this is not something that's going to be solved overnight, but the conversation needs to happen. And I think that my two colleagues are bringing important pieces of that conversation to the debate today, but there's a lot of other pieces out there that we need to bring in and make sure that everybody can chime in.
So I think that makes sense. And Cheryl earlier talked about, AI is only as good as the people who program it. There's a lot of research that indicates algorithms that presumably adjust the data. Well, depends what data you feed in with the tracking. But at some level, the First Amendment matters. And at some level, it is problematic that someone, be it Cheryl or Bradley or me or Vincent or Craig or Errol or anybody else on this call, is going to make the decision. Bradley, is this a marketplace issue? Whose job is this?
Well, so, I truly don't think it's a First Amendment issue. I think it's a open internet issue. And do we believe that an open internet is good? And that the benefits to society outweigh the negatives? And, I think Trump getting elected to some extent marked a turning point in that conversation and in at least the public discourse. Because if you looked at the way people talked about the internet as it related to, elections and to government before, it was disrupting dictatorships. It was disrupting elections for good. The notion of disruption was a great thing. And suddenly now everyone's connected. And we realize some of the people we're connected with might be a little crazy or we don't agree with. And others are misusing it. But this notion of right and wrong versus outcomes I like and don't, I think is a really important one, particularly as we talk about digital and digital ethics, because a lot of the things we're talking about now as bad for society only became bad when they helped get Trump elected. They weren't bad when they helped get Obama elected. So that to me is a really interesting piece of this conversation that isn't talked about quite a bit. One of Obama's the biggest innovations from that campaign was a tool that allowed you to it was a Facebook app. You could give it permission. It would pull all your friends, information about your friends, and it would let you reach. It would say like, these 5 people, we want you to reach out and tell them to support the president. And that was hailed as like one of the most remarkable pieces of technology, game-changing piece of technology. Everyone who was writing about it at the time knew that it was pulling all of this data. And then Cambridge Analytica came along, claimed to do a lot of stuff, which that's a whole separate conversation of, most of the stuff that people are mad at them for doing, they either don't do or didn't do for Trump or Ted Cruz. But they had a similar process of pull data down. And granted, it was under a guise of something else, but I don't believe that's truly why people are mad at it. It's not because I was tricked to giving that data. It's because it was used to get an outcome I don't like.
Cheryl, you use this data, right? You make a living analyzing and finding and manipulating this data to get people to do what you think is the right thing to do. What's your take on Bradley's analysis here?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree. I mean, even, as we were, beginning to sell attentively, it was because even before Trump was elected, the privacy policies of in the way that you could use data was beginning to tighten up among the software platforms. So that was already happening, and we understood that, you know, attentively needed to be inside a CRM and inside, you know, a place where it could, you know, research data that was already, you know, people had opted in essentially to that. So, you know, I don't know that I actually agree on the premise. And also, look, Barack Obama is a different person from Donald Trump. And if we're, you know, if you want to talk about Nazis, I mean, Donald Trump is running on a clearly white supremacist platform. There's no question about that at this point. So, you know, is that right? Is that good? Do we want to reward that behavior? Do I agree with how Cloudflare did what it did to the Daily Stormer? No, not necessarily. I think there's value in actually, you know, hearing voices that are different from yours, even poisonous, even dangerous voices. However, you know, do we allow those people to commit illegal acts? You know, do we allow those people to attack people, to dox them, to threaten them? You know, do we allow those people to spread, you know, fictional, harmful, you know, genocidal content? That, I think, is where we start to draw the line between, are there any limits?
But so Cheryl, I think you just made the point I was making, where you said it's okay for. I'm now kind of putting words in your mouth that make my point, but that Trump and Obama are different. Yes, in that it's fine that Obama was using it because he was inherently good, and it's problematic that Trump is using the same technology because he's bad. And I guess that's the broader point I'm trying to make, that when we look at digital ethics and some of these questions through the lens of you know, whether I got the outcome I wanted, I think that's inherently, you know, problematic. I think some of the decisions we're making now as a society, whether it's this notion that we shouldn't use that digital ad targeting should be restricted, is bad for democracy. I mean, it all that does is empower incumbents. It empowers people that are rich, that have lots of money. You're going to get a lot less AOCs, for example, who couldn't you know, raise their profile from the start using very targeted you know, digital and social media ads. And I guess the question is, you know, is that good for democracy?
Yeah, so you are putting words in my mouth. So, but what I said was not clear. So let me clarify. Technology is a hammer, right? It's a tool, right? And you can use that tool to build a house for someone who needs a home, or you can use that tool to beat someone to death. Do we as a society have an interest in encouraging people to use hammers for one purpose and not another?
So how do you get them to do that?
So,
what's the incentive?
So I would just one other piece, because I think if it wasn't Trump, if it was someone else, we'd be having a similar conversation. If you look at some of the things that were said about Mitt Romney when he was running for president, for example, people were saying some of the very same things that are being said now. And that's not to say, you know, what's being said about Trump isn't true, but it is to say that, like, when we start having the slope of I want an outcome, I want my side to get elected, it's easy to apply broad generalizations or tags, or even it's bad for them to have it because they'll do X, Y, or Z. That frankly, I think, you know, just gets us to a really tough and tricky place.
Yeah, and again, I don't agree with your premise that that's what happened. As I said, as someone who was using some of the same technology as Cambridge Analytica, but in different ways, and ways that were, approved and known by Facebook, some of those things were already, even as the 2016 election was happening, they were already contracting. Okay. They were already, changing, how things were happening. And look, this is new technology. The outcomes are still not necessarily predictable, right? I mean, no one understood exactly what was happening. And it's not necessarily, again, I would say that, in the case of Trump, it's not, everybody was using the same tools. They were just using those tools in some ways differently to push different content to a different group of people, including content that was just openly false or hate-filled.
I want to give, with an eye to the clock, I want to ask Vincent a question and then come back to all of you for concluding thoughts. You said we couldn't fix this overnight. It turns out we also can't fix it in an hour, sadly. So you study digital politics, protest politics, online politics in the US, in Canada. You've done a lot of work in Canada and on the Canadian elections. From that view of just outside, not just the US context, but the global context, what's your take on this conversation?
Conversation that we're having right now is a conversation that's happening everywhere. This is not new. I mean, for example, the use of technologies in Australia, the use of technologies for targeting in Canada, that's a big issue. And one thing that's really interesting as well is that a lot of people are sort of amazed that this conversation is happening. And a lot of my students at Emerson are always saying, my God, why is this happening? Well, I told them, if you read the terms of service of the different platforms, you'd be aware that this is happening. This is not something that we should be surprised about necessarily. Obviously, certain users are really, but what I really want to emphasize here is a lot of this conversation we're having about ethics really needs to incorporate the notion of transparency. For example, a lot of politicians out there are using dark ads, right? Dark ads that are showing up in people's private timelines or feeds, but that they're not necessarily showing, that can't be really known to everybody else. So I think we need to be really careful when it comes to ethics. This needs to be, at its core, ethics is about educating the public and making sure that the public is aware of everything. If there's no awareness, there's no ethics to some degree. So we do need to be really careful to make sure that people are aware of what's happening. And obviously we need to have a conversation about this. The disagreement between my two colleagues is not something that's unique to the US context. This is happening all over the world. And obviously there's a big cultural dimension to this. And that's another really interesting thing. The notion of culture and ethics is huge, right? So what is perceived as good versus what is perceived as bad, it varies from country to country, and it varies from individual to individual. So we need, I think, to have a really important and robust conversation about, first of all, what is good and what is bad. And then when we agree on this, then we can move on to talking about, well, what is good and what is bad in political communication and digital campaigning. But there's a serious conversation that needs to be had, and the current context is really driving us to have this conversation.
So in this 6.5 minutes remaining, I want to turn this to Cheryl and then to Bradley, then I'm going to have about a 30-second wrap. So Cheryl, any parting thoughts or last words or where we take this conversation next?
We're in the struggle of a lifetime. As I said, the concept of, what is ethics today in political communications is something that we're going to continue to wrestle with probably for the next 10 or 20 years as this technology continues to become more sophisticated and generates outcomes that are unexpected and changes society as we know it. In some ways, we're living through a golden age. I'm in so many ways optimistic and sanguine about what's possible. At the same time, I do think we need to understand that the hammer principle. What are we using this hammer to do, and what are we comfortable using? The hammer itself is not the good. It is what the hammer produces. And hopefully we can start to apply that concept, that notion, to these technical platforms and innovations.
Last thoughts, Bradley?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just go back to ethics as a right versus wrong, not a good versus bad outcome. I think you see a lot of this in the conversation, even how consultants act for 3 or 4 years. Misinformation was the big thing, that misinformation is bad, fake news is bad, manipulation is bad. Pacronym, which is a Democrat super PAC, created solely with the intent to defeat Trump, which lots of super PACs obviously do. They built a quote unquote news operation where they have websites that masquerade as independent journalism. And it's really rapid response style communication, attacking Republicans, whether it's for Senate or president. And I guess my question is, I'm curious why something like that is now okay after we talked about fake news, misinformation, trusted news sources being such big deals. In 2014, the NRCC created a series of news landing pages. They clearly said paid for by the NRCC at the bottom, but did something similar, and there was huge outrage. And so I'm curious how, short of good outcome that I like, bad outcome that I don't, that was a problem for a lot on the left in 2014, but there's not outrage in 2020. So thanks for having this conversation, Peter. I think a super important one for for society and for the industry for sure.
I think a lot to chew on, and a lot of interesting questions are raised, none of which are going to be answered in the moment. But I think we still come back to things that what are the ethical boundaries? What are your responsibilities as a professor, as a public intellectual, as advocates? What are our responsibilities as citizens, and what does it mean to be ethical in this society whose job is this? And it has to be an ongoing conversation. But the late Congressman John Lewis had an op-ed, a posthumous op-ed run in the paper today, in which he pointed out that democracy is an act. And I think part of this conversation is part of that act of democracy, as is the ongoing campaign and the ongoing advocacy. And I think we need to honor that. We need to honor Mr. Lewis's words of it as an act. So thank you for engaging in this conversation. Thank you for continuing to have it. I'm going to put out 3 plugs before we go. One is, once again, for Craig Vachon's book, Knucklehead of Silicon Valley. Cheryl Contee's book, Mechanical Bull. Terrific read, a fun read. And of course, the book I edited, in which Cheryl and Vincent have co-authored chapters, Political Communication Ethics Theory and Practice. We're going to have a book event for that next week, in which a colleague of mine, Frank Sesno, who's a former Washington bureau chief for CNN, is going to interview me and one of my students, Anthony Thomas, who's a rising junior at GW, who took my political communication ethics class and an active in local politics. Anthony Frank and I are going to have a conversation about. We're going to have this conversation again next week. So if you like it now, you're going to love it then. We will post the video. I've saved the chat. I will post the chat because I think it's been an interesting conversation, including the links. Follow Bradley, Cheryl, and Vincent on Twitter. We're going to share their Twitter handles as well. And thank all of you for all of your time and for your commitment to helping political communication be a little more ethical. Have a great afternoon, everybody.